One of the biggest gaps in play formatting that can exist between groups of RPG players is dungeon length. There are some groups happy to spend an entire campaign on a single dungeon. There are other groups that clear a dungeon a session, maybe even more than one. And there are also those who don't have proper dungeons at all. But we don't like the last group here. I wanted to contrast the two most common dungeon sizes. These are what I will be calling multi-day and single-day dungeons. Essentially, are you going to go back to a town to rest between expeditions? We will be ignoring mega dungeons, which are entire campaigns consisting of one dungeon, for now. I, like many newer players, started playing RPGs with 5th edition. 5th edition is, in large part, a single session dungeon game. Here, sit with me. No, what's it? Alright. 5th edition is in large part a single session dungeon game. Thing I realized most acutely fairly recently when I wanted to write a multi-level dungeon that involved going back and forth to rest. I've also read a lot of modules, most of which are built with a single long rest before and after each dungeon in mind. You aren't meant to be long resting in the middle in most of the current official material. And this has been changing, but early 5e also assumes you have time for short resting, which is implied to be the kind of dungeon resting method. Newer books have been writing out the short resting, which is frustrating as a dungeon master, because I quite like the short resting mechanics. I think you kind of screw over 5e once you're writing them out. This is most obvious with the monsters in the multiverse, where they reroll all the racial abilities to use proficiency bonus for charges instead of short rests. D&D 5.5 just seems to be shaping up to be the entire dungeon is done at once without any rests. And I can speak from experience that this format is pretty good for one-shots, but has some awkward aspects in longer-term campaign. Let me direct you to Icewind Dale, one of the modules I've had the pleasure of running. In this module, there are a lot of dungeons, but only 7-ish are connected to the overarching plot. Sorry to interrupt. I wanted to add that this structure allows the copy-pasting of dungeons into your own campaign to be a lot easier, which can assist with modules and versatility across, because a lot of people don't run modules straight. See, the adventures are structured with 2 chunks of time where the players are just kinda herring through side quests, and this is most of the first 5 levels of the game before they're brought to the proper plot. The thing is, the proper plot was set up in 2 of the dungeons, which are optional and also kinda blend in with all the others, so the plot turns out rather random, and I ended up not finishing the campaign with my group, because the further plot right after a certain point just kinda comes off disconnected. That also comes in addition to the in-universe weirdness of this random group just showed up and took out 7 monster layers in a week before finding a dragon, and doubled in power twice in that time, because a few dungeons are all it really takes to level up if you're running EXP. But the awkwardness aside, single rest dungeons need a relatively small amount of prep work. It's much easier to manage a campaign where you make something small each week instead of something big before you start. So what about this mysterious and alien multi-day dungeon format that I talked about at the beginning? Well, I haven't had the opportunity to run a proper one yet, so most of what I'll be talking about is a degree of speculation based on reading. I have read plenty of older modules, but multi-day dungeons seem to have been what early D&D was mostly structured around, and they'd normally be set up right next to a town. This makes for a fairly straightforward adventure format where each section you dive into a several story dungeon to see how much closer you can get to the conclusion, and then you go back to town to rest. Which reminds me a bit of video games, more specifically Final Fantasy Legend. I think Saga also was what it was called, and its sequels. These were released for the Game Boy. The first one is in 1989, a little over a decade before I was conceived, but through the power of re-releases, I have all 3 on my Switch today. I don't play retro because they made better games. I play retro because all the bad games from that time were just kinda forgotten. In these games, you were ascending this giant kinda mega dungeon, and every once in a while you'd arrive on a new floor that can act as your new town, and you basically have a new dungeon going on once you get to these floors. And a particularly fun gameplay loop, because while a normal man might think you were just supposed to grind levels until you can do the entire thing in one shot, the fun way to play was to stockpile healing items and other single-use items and go on an expedition until you run out, then you retreat and try again, until eventually you make it through. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but that's how I picture these dungeons being formatted. The party makes it in, and they may not be capable of clearing everything, but they should be capable of getting maybe the first magic item and 50 gold pieces before they need to retreat. They spend 50 gold pieces on a bomb and some healing potions, they steal a new shield from that one blacksmith that was a little bit too rude to the rogue, and they return to the dungeon the next day. This time you make it a little further, maybe you even level up. Maybe the long rests take a week, so in between sessions, your characters get a week of downtime. You can do quite a bit with this. That's how a lot of old modules I've read are formatted, most notably White Plume Mountain, which even had some kind of disease that only affects you on like the third time you enter the dungeon. I've been running one of these, so maybe if you subscribe, you might be able to catch an update video in 8 to 20 weeks. See y'all next week.